We built 48,000 miles of highway to connect America. What we didn't realize is that we also built the perfect hunting ground for murder. I'm Becca, and you are listening to Deadly Truths, Season 11. This is Interstate, highly deadly. Ted Bundy may be one of the most overcovered killers in American history. Everyone knows the mask by now, the smile, the law student act, the courtroom spectacle, the headlines. But the version people miss is the one that matters here. Not Bundy, the media obsession. Bundy, the mobile predator. Bundy, the interstate-era killer. A man who came of age in a country where distance was getting smaller, roads were getting faster, and crossing state lines was easier than ever. This is not just a story about what Ted Bundy did. It's a story about the kind of America that helped him do it longer. Before we go further, listener discretion is advised. This episode contains discussion of rape, murder, and necrophilia. I never really wanted to do an episode on Ted Bundy because, frankly, he's been done to death. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't been drawn to the case since I was a preteen. There was something uniquely terrifying about him. When I was young, Bundy felt like the real boogeyman. I knew he was a rapist. I knew he was a murderer. I knew he had killed multiple women. What I didn't understand until I was much older was just how depraved he actually was, how far across the country he was able to move, and how much horror he carried with him. Once I understood that, he became even more frightening than he had been before. Ted Bundy looked like the kind of man America was trained to trust. That is part of what still makes him so unnerving. He did not read like a monster at first glance. He read like a guy your parents would have approved of. Clean-cut, educated, articulate, ambitious. The kind of man who could put on a decent jacket, smile at the right time, and pass himself off as respectable in a country that has always confused surface polish with character. And people did. That is what made him so effective. He was not like many of the killers we have come to know, because none of us want to think people like this are out there. But Bundy was different, in one especially disturbing way. You might have fallen for it. You might have trusted him. You might have let him get close enough to hurt you. That is what makes him simpler in one sense and uglier in another. He understood appearances. He understood how badly people wanted evil to look evil. And because he knew that, he could walk right through the front door of other people's assumptions. For years, Ted Bundy has been sold back to the public as this terrifying contradiction. Handsome but deadly, charming but vicious, smart but monstrous. That framing is not totally false, but it lets him off too easy. It turns him into a dark fairy tale, a villain with a cinematic sheen, a horror movie wolf in loafers. What most people did not know about this guy was that beneath all the tidy packaging, he was a grade A piece of shit. A sadistic, lying, sexually violent coward who learned early that he could get farther with a cast on his arm and a fake smile than he ever could with brute force alone. Strip away the mythology, and that is what is left. A petty, parasitic man who fed on vulnerability and called it power. That matters, because Bundy has been flattened by overexposure. He has been turned into a brand of evil, a rerun, a face on endless streaming thumbnails. But in real life, there was nothing dazzling about him. He raped women, he bludgeoned them, he strangled them. He revisited bodies and had sex with corpses, not once, more than once. He even drove close to 6 hours to return to a dead body and then 6 hours back home. Think about that. This is a man who is played by very attractive men in miniseries and movies. He raped and murdered 12-year-old girls, too, not just young adult women. He was not just a murderer and rapist, which is horrifying alone. He was a pedophile and necrophiliac. That part of the story is very seldom covered for obvious reasons, but it is important to understand just how evil this man was. If you believe in evil, that was Bundy. He desecrated remains. The more you learn about what he actually did, the less impressive he becomes and the more revolting he gets, which frankly is the correct reaction. By the time Bundy began building the body count that would make him infamous, a lot of people still saw him as promising. He had worked in political circles. He could speak well. He knew how to mimic concern, competence, and normalcy. He could sound thoughtful. He could play earnest. This is the part that keeps him in the news, that allows him to seep back into our culture every generation, because of the fact that he was really good at pretending to be statistically normal, possibly even above average. He knew how to wear the costume of a decent man so well that even after women started disappearing, a lot of people still had trouble reconciling the image with the reality. That disconnect is one of the central failures in this story. We love the myth of the obvious predator. We want the villain to announce himself. We want him filthy, raving, and easy to spot from a block away. Bundy understood that fantasy better than most. We now diagnose someone like him with antisocial disorder, but beneath that diagnosis is a sociopath. Bundy is the textbook version and one of the most dangerous versions. He knew that if he looked presentable, if he sounded polished, if he seemed like the kind of man who belonged in a college town or a campaign office or a law classroom, he could buy himself time. And time, for Ted Bundy, was blood. He loved setting traps. Even as a kid, he did that, and when he got older, he set much more dangerous traps, and he loved it. Every nasty and sick part of it. Before he became a true multi-state predator, before his name stretched across the map like a shit stain, Bundy was already killing in Washington. That is where the known pattern takes shape. In 1974, young women vanished from familiar places, campuses, public spaces, everyday life. Women who had every reason to think they were moving through the world normally. Women who had no idea a violent opportunist was studying how to turn ordinary moments into fatal ones. This is also where Bundy's method starts to reveal exactly what he was. He was a manipulator, a user, a cheap con artist. He often approached women by pretending to need help. That is one of the bleakest details in the whole case. He weaponized decency. He counted on women being socialized to be polite, to be helpful, to ignore discomfort, to override instincts so they would not seem rude. That is social rot, meeting male violence in the middle. His car mattered too. Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle became one of the most infamous vehicles in crime history, and not because it looked sinister. It did not. That was the point. It was small, common, unremarkable. The sort of car no one would remember until it was already too late. Not a creepy van, not some hulking predator that would have set off alarms. Just a familiar little car that could slide through parking lots and campus areas without drawing much notice. That humble little Beetle was part of the disguise. Inside it, though, was the reality. That car gave him a mobile enclosure, a controlled space, a tool for containment and transport. It let him move victims away from the place where they had last felt safe. It let him leave one scene and create another. It let him turn public trust into private terror in a matter of minutes. And that is where this story starts to shift from local horror into something larger. Because once Bundy had his method, once he had learned how much he could get away with, the road stopped being just a way to get around and became part of the machinery. His hunting ground in Washington had already shown him what was possible. He had the look, he had the line, he had the car, he had an MO built on feigned helplessness, sudden violence, and mobility. And the body count was already growing. This is the part where people often want to talk about him like he was building towards something grand, like he was evolving into his final form. That gives him too much credit. He was not a shark. He was not Hannibal Lecter. He was a cruel little fraud, getting bolder because the world kept failing to stop him. Still, escalation matters. By the summer of 1974, Bundy was no longer just a dangerous man operating in familiar territory. He was becoming something worse, portable. His violence was no longer tied only to a local pattern that might eventually corner him. He was about to leave the Pacific Northwest and head for Utah, carrying with him everything that had already worked: the mask, the manipulation, the beetle, the confidence that came from surviving suspicion and outrunning consequence. That move is where this episode really begins. Because if Washington was Ted Bundy learning the game, the road was where he realized the board was bigger than anyone had told him, bigger than one city, bigger than one police department, bigger than one cluster of missing women that local law enforcement might someday piece together. He had already proven what he was in Washington, a sexual sadist hiding inside the costume of a decent man. Now he was about to test whether that same act could travel. And in a country freshly built for distance, speed, and disappearing into the next jurisdiction, the answer was yes. So when Ted Bundy finally hit the road, he was not leaving his hunting ground behind. He was expanding it. When Bundy got to Salt Lake City in August 1974, he did not arrive as some unknown drifter looking for a fresh start. He arrived as a man already carrying a private history of violence, now setting himself up in a new city with a new excuse for belonging there. Law school at the University of Utah. On paper, it looked upwardly mobile. In reality, Utah gave him exactly what men like Bundy thrive on: space and a population that had no reason yet to see him coming. Salt Lake gave him a different terrain than Seattle. The Pacific Northwest had already shown him he could approach women in public, manipulate them at close range, and vanish back into ordinary life. Utah widened the field. He was no longer moving through one familiar region. He was now operating from a central base with easy access outward, and that mattered. The FBI's account is blunt. After he moved to Salt Lake City, the murders continued in Utah, Idaho, and Colorado. That is the moment the case stops feeling regional and starts looking like a killer testing how far one life can stretch across multiple states before the pattern catches up to him. And almost immediately, the violence resumed. According to accounts tied to Bundy's later confessions, one of the earliest known attacks after the move was the murder of an unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho in September 1974. Then in October, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox disappeared from Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. The same month, Melissa Smith, the daughter of a police chief in Midvale, vanished after leaving a pizza parlor. Her body was found days later in the mountains. In November, Laura Amy disappeared after leaving a cafe in Lehigh, and her body was later discovered in a canyon. The Utah phase was not subtle in hindsight. Women were disappearing in and around the Salt Lake area, and Bundy was once again using normal life as camouflage. What changed in Utah was not his nature, it was his reach. From Salt Lake, he moved into a broader Western circuit. In 1975, the violence pushed outward into Colorado and Idaho. Corinne Campbell vanished from a hotel in Snowmass. Julie Cunningham disappeared in Vail. Denise Oliverson vanished in Grand Junction while riding her bicycle. Lynette Culver disappeared in Pocatello, Idaho. Susan Curtis vanished from the BYU campus in Provo in June 1975. Some bodies were never recovered. Some cases remained stitched together only later through confession, circumstantial evidence, or the awful consistency of his behavior. That uncertainty actually makes the Utah period worse, not better. It suggests a killer moving through open country with enough confidence to leave damage scattered across a wide map. Salt Lake City was also where the facade finally started to crack. In August 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer stopped Bundy in the early morning after noticing him cruising through a residential area in his Volkswagen Beetle. Inside the car were a ski mask, another mask made from pantyhose, handcuffs, a crowbar, rope, trash bags, and an ice pick. That is one of the most maddening parts of Bundy's story. He looked caught, but he was not finished. The stop mattered because it cracked the shell. It gave police something concrete. Then came the lineup. On October 2nd, 1975, Carol Durange, who had survived his attempted abduction in Utah, identified him. That identification changed the stakes. Bundy was charged, and by March 1st, 1976, he was convicted of aggravated kidnapping. For once, somebody had managed to pin something real on him. But Ted Bundy, in one of history's most infuriating demonstrations of institutional overconfidence, was then allowed to keep playing law student theater while in custody. After investigators tied him to the murder of Corinne Campbell in Colorado, he was extradited to Aspen in early 1977 to face trial there. And because America apparently looked at this manipulative, homicidal creep and thought, sure, let's give him room to roam, Bundy was granted access to the courthouse law library to work on his own defense. Unshackled, unguarded, a murder defendant with escape fantasies and a talent for exploiting arrogance was basically handed a stage and told not to get any ideas. Naturally, he got ideas. On June 7, 1977, he jumped from a second-floor window of the Pitkin County Courthouse and disappeared into the mountains outside Aspen. It was brazen, stupid, and weirdly on brand. Bundy was not subtle when opportunity opened up. He just lunged for daylight. The escape lasted almost a week before he was caught driving a stolen car and brought back. That should have ended the improvisation. It should have convinced everyone involved that this man could not be trusted with an ounce of latitude. It did not. Instead, after being transferred to a jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy got even more dangerous because he got more patient. He lost enough weight to squeeze through a hole he had cut in the ceiling of his cell, crawled into the duct space above, and on the night of December 30th, 1977, escaped again. This time, he did not just bolt from a building and hope for the best. He got into the empty apartment of a jail employee, changed clothes, and vanished for real. Then he left Colorado entirely. That second escape is where the story turns from outrageous to catastrophic. Bundy was no longer just a prisoner who had embarrassed the local authorities. He was a mobile predator loose again, heading east and eventually landing in Florida. The first arrest had exposed him. The escapes proved something worse. Even when Ted Bundy was in custody, the system still underestimated how fast he could turn freedom into blood. You really can't make this shit up. After Bundy pulled off his second escape, he did not head into hiding the way a normal fugitive might. He went back into circulation like a roach that had learned how to use public transit. He drove a stolen car to Denver, flew to Chicago, traveled on to Michigan, stole another car, then worked his way south by bus until he reached Tallahassee, Florida on January 8, 1978. That entire sequence is one long indictment of 1970s security, 1970s record sharing, and frankly, 1970s adults who kept treating this man like an unusually annoying debate student instead of a homicidal scavenger. Florida was not supposed to be a reset button. It became a blood-soaked sequel. Bundy rented a room near the Florida State University campus under the name Chris Hagen and started drifting around Tallahassee like the human equivalent of bad wiring behind a wall, hidden, unstable, and about to burn the whole place down. 7 days after arriving, in the early hours of January 15, 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door, armed with a wooden club he had picked up outside. What happened next took place in minutes, which is part of what makes it so horrifying. He bludgeoned Margaret Bowman, age 21, to death. He then attacked Lisa Levy, age 20, beating and strangling her, and sexually assaulted her before killing her. In the same burst of violence, he viciously assaulted Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler, who survived. And because apparently Florida had been cursed by some bored god that month, Bundy did not stop there. After leaving Chi Omega, he went to a nearby house on Dunwoody Street, entered another sleeping young woman's room, and attacked Cheryl Thomas, leaving her with severe injuries. She survived, but with lasting damage. That means that in one night, Bundy tore through multiple victims in multiple locations like he had been dropped into town, specifically to prove that every institutional mistake made before Florida was about to cost even more women their lives. That attack is important for another reason. Until then, Bundy had so often relied on luring women away, isolating them, transporting them, controlling the sequence. In Tallahassee, the violence became even more brazen. He invaded a female space and unleashed chaos at close range. There was no polished, fake routine here, no patient setup, no social performance. This was a man unraveling and improvising with the same cruelty he had always carried, only now under pressure, on the run, and slipping further into his real form. Then, because the universe apparently wanted one more reason to despise him, he kept going. On February 9, 1978, less than a month after the Chi Omega murders, Bundy abducted Kimberly Leach, a 12-year-old student from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. That is the point where whatever tired media shorthand once framed him as the killer of young women in college towns crashes into the wall of what he actually was, a sexually violent predator with no bottom. Kimberly disappeared that morning, and her remains were found on April 7, 1978, in a wooded area west of Lake City. Investigators later tied Bundy to the abduction and murder through witness statements and physical evidence linked to the van he had stolen. So, looking only at Florida, the murders and known attacks tied to Bundy after his escape stack up like this. He arrived in Tallahassee on January 8, 1978. On January 15th, he murdered Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy at Chi Omega and severely injured Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler. That same night, he brutally attacked Cheryl Thomas, who survived. On February 9th, he kidnapped and murdered Kimberly Leach. That is what we know. Those are the Florida victims clearly tied to him in the final phase before his capture. Some summaries note that Bundy ultimately confessed to 30 murders across 7 states, but Florida is where his last confirmed known killings occurred before he was stopped for good. And how did it finally end? Not with some grand detective masterstroke that redeemed every earlier screw-up. On February 15, 1978, a Pensacola police officer stopped a stolen Volkswagen after noticing it being driven suspiciously. Bundy fought like a rat in a trap, but this time he lost. Once in custody, the walls finally started closing in. Witness identifications, physical evidence, and the sheer wreckage behind him made Florida the place where his myth of mobility finally crashed. And that is really the ugly truth of Florida in the Bundy story. This was not a clever final act. It was a system failure with a body count. A man escaped custody, crossed the country, dropped into a college town, murdered women in their beds, attacked more women blocks away, abducted a child, and still only got stopped because a patrol officer noticed the wrong car being driven the wrong way by the wrong man. It is so absurd, it almost sounds fictional, except fiction usually has the decency to make the adults less useless. Florida did not reveal some new Ted Bundy. It revealed the fully stripped down version. No campaign office sheen, no law school cosplay, no fake upward trajectory, just a violent parasite on borrowed time, moving fast and leaving devastation wherever the road led him off. Could Ted Bundy have killed without the interstate system? Yes. Roads existed before the modern highway network, and Bundy's violence came from his own sadism, manipulation, and willingness to move victims away from safety. The roads did not create Ted Bundy, but could he have covered that much ground, crossed that many jurisdictions, and kept killing so fluidly without the interstate era? Probably not in the same way. The FBI's account shows his murders stretched from Washington into Utah, Idaho, Colorado, and later Florida. And that kind of geographic spread mattered because investigators in the 1970s were still dealing with weaker information sharing across state lines. So the honest answer is this: the interstate did not make Bundy a killer. It made him a more mobile one. It gave him speed, distance, and the kind of administrative gaps a predator could slip through. Florida knew it had a monster. It just did not realize right away that the monster already had a national file. The road did not hand Bundy every victim, but it expanded his menu. Without that mobility, he does not get the same access to women across 7 states. The road did not invent the serial killer. It industrialized his reach. Bundy taught America a few ugly things. First, he taught people that danger does not always look dangerous. He was able to gain access to victims by using charm, normalcy, and ruses, which wrecked the comforting fantasy that predators are always obvious on sight. Research on offender behavior and Bundy's own case both emphasize how he exploited trust and helpfulness to get close to women. Second, he taught law enforcement that serial murder could be mobile, patterned, and cross state lines in ways local agencies were not ready for. The FBI's writing on Bundy places him in the period when behavioral analysis was developing, and his case helped expose how hard it was to connect murders spread across multiple jurisdictions. Third, he taught America that media can turn a killer into a spectacle. Bundy's trials, interviews, and public image helped create the modern celebrity serial killer problem, where coverage can drift from facts into fascination. Scholars and media analysis both point to Bundy as a major example of that shift. Bundy did not help the FBI by being insightful or useful as a person. He helped by being a case that exposed what law enforcement was missing. The FBI's own history says the 1970s serial murder cases, including Bundy, pushed the development of behavioral analysis and profiling tools because investigators were trying to understand offenders whose crimes crossed patterns and jurisdictions. He also helped show how bad agencies were at sharing information across states. Bundy's murders stretched across multiple states before the full pattern was recognized, and that kind of case reinforced the need for better coordination, centralized records, and later systems like VICAP for linking violent crimes. Bundy died on January 24, 1989 at Florida State Prison in Rayford/Stark, Florida, when he was executed in the electric chair. He was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. His widely cited last words were, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Of all the states Bundy could have fled to, he picked one with an active death chamber. Great instincts, Ted. Ted Bundy did not invent the serial killer. He did not invent violence against women, and he did not invent the American road. But he exploited all three with a level of cruelty that still feels hard to process. He moved through a country built for speed, distance, and reinvention, and for too long, that made him harder to stop. What this case shows is not that the interstate created evil. It is that evil adapts. It studies the system. It learns the blind spots. And in Bundy's case, it found a nation where one man could cross state lines faster than law enforcement could connect the dead. That is what made Ted Bundy more than just another serial killer. It made him one of the clearest examples of what happens when charm, mobility, and institutional failure collide. If you found this episode compelling, follow Deadly Truths with Becca on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you listen or watch, and share this episode with someone who loves true crime history. And remember, the past isn't dead. It's walking the shoulder after dark.